Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Faruk Rahmanovich, and I'm joined today by Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
In this series, we're doing a chapter by chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book, A Young Muslim's Guide to the West. And we'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and delving more deeply into the ideas within these passages, like what implications can you draw or what conclusions can you come to, and showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more closely. In today's session, we'll be looking at chapter 5, the Islamic science. All right,
Okay,
so what caught your attention this time around?
let's look towards the conclusion for this one. So, if you turn to page 101, we have a section entitled Conclusion: The Significance of the Islamic Sciences for Muslims. So, most of this chapter has been focused on the scientific contributions of Muslims throughout many centuries, right? Starting from the second century after Hijrah until well into the 10th century. And unfortunately, a lot of Muslims today don't know much about these things. Let's take a look at what Sayyid Hussein Nasr has to say in this paragraph here. The significance of the vast Islamic scientific tradition for Muslims, and especially for young Muslims today, is not only that it gives them a sense of pride in their own civilization because of the prestige that science has in the present day world. It is furthermore a testament to the way Islam was able to cultivate various sciences extensively without becoming alienated from the Islamic worldview and without creating a science whose application would destroy the world of nature and the harmony that must exist between man and the natural environment. The Islamic sciences are not only important from the point of view of science, understood in its current Western sense, but they also have a spiritual and intellectual significance. Their study and understanding is important in order to create a bridge in the mind of young Muslims between Western science, which many of them are studying, and the tenets of Islam to which they must remain faithful. The great achievement of the Muslim men of science was that they had the most rigorous standards of critical thought and were scientists of integrity without at the same time losing their faith or becoming alienated from the Islamic view of the universe within which all of the Islamic sciences were cultivated. So, one of the first things that stands out to me here about this one is actually something we talked about when we were looking at chapter 4. Towards the end, we discussed the idea of the conflict thesis, right? The idea that there must be some inherent conflict between religion and science. And just like in the previous chapter, one of Nasser's goals here is to dispel that notion. Now, if we go back to the beginning, he starts off by saying the significance of the vast Islamic scientific tradition for Muslims, and especially for young Muslims today, is not only that it gives them a sense of pride in their own civilization because of the prestige that science has in the present day world. Let's start by breaking this down. So, towards the end of the sentence, he says that there is a certain prestige that science has in the present day world. I think that even if it's not something that you'd really considered before, if you take the time and think about it, you realize, yeah, that's pretty much true. People will say things like, well, science says this, or, well, I have this study about this here. And they essentially take it as gospel truth right there. You have any thoughts on that subject?
So yeah, the prestige of science is there with the idea of what science does for us, and it solves problems, and the better you are at sciencey kinds of things, the more contribution you can sort of seem to make. We had this conversation last week actually about the um, contributing to society kind of uh, view and what makes you valuable and not valuable. So science has what we would consider a very direct material contribution to the world, right? Like as we speak right now, there is a bunch of scientists developing a COVID vaccine, right? And that is a very material kind of benefit. So it's easy to understand, I think, why a materially oriented society would be all about science. which isn't to say that a society that isn't materialistically oriented is going to denigrate science. It's just that it's going to be one part of their understanding of the world, whereas a purely materialistic society is going to have to see that as essentially the entirety of their world.
Sure, and that's where you end up with ideas like science-ism, where
Yes,
people essentially function as science-ists as opposed to being scientists. They have essentially gone beyond just, well, I am someone who does science, and they are, well, I am someone who, quote, believes in science. It essentially functions as a replacement religion.
yes, and so scientists are your new priesthood, and it has an ongoing revelation, right? Every month or every quarter, there's an update to the revelation, and you're supposed to keep up with it as these preachers from on high tell you what's true. Actually, unlike revelation, though, there is no stability.
Sure, right. I was going to say, never mind the cognitive dissonance that comes from that.
Yes, because you have to wear sunscreen or you will get skin cancer. Except that the sunscreen seems to have a chemical in it that gives you skin cancer. So it's it's a wonderfully screwy system. But for anybody who's not deep into this, the idea behind scientism is a sort of belief not only that, well, it starts off with the notion that science is true and it gives us truth. And then it continues to say something like, and science will solve all of our problems, regardless of what the problems are. And you got to ask yourself some questions like, well, how's science going to, solve our political problems? Like, what kind of a government should we have? And the answer is, shut up, it's science, right?
Well, there's people who are trying to work on exactly that, right?
All right. So I think that if science is considered the sort of currency of modernity, which is part of what seems to be coming up here, then a danger, especially uh, for the younger generation of Muslims, although I don't really think we're much better with the older generation on this point either, is that if they don't understand how Islam and how religion in general, and specifically how Islam relates to science, then they're stuck in a very unenviable position, right? They are going to be viewing the thing that they are as being culturally worthless. And because no matter what you are, there's some kind of a cost associated with it, right? Sort of the opportunity cost of being anything, then it becomes a really unsolvable. Well, it's not unsolvable. I guess it's insolvable to remain rooted to Islam. But the problem is something like, why am I part of this thing that has this very high opportunity cost in a place where the benefits of that thing are irrelevant? In a system where no part of what Islam offers is considered to be in any way valuable. And so I think that the real value of this chapter is really something along the lines of introducing the reader to the fact that Islam was one of the largest developers of science in human history. And in fact, I think, so it's somewhere around page 88 when Nasr is talking about the project of translating all of these sciences into Arabic because they were taken from everywhere. He calls it the a major event in cultural history of humanity, right?
Mhm.
Getting everything sort of into a lingua franca from which it can then be disseminated, and at which point it can actually be worked on as a uniform set of sciences instead of stuff that's in Chinese and then stuff that's in Hindi and stuff that's in Greek, and you'd have to go and learn all of those languages and then find their respective areas of study and then study them. This sort of made it kind of universally accessible, which also then means that it made it relatively accessible to Europeans because all you needed was somebody who spoke Latin and Arabic, and congratulations, you now have a way of translating world knowledge into what was a relatively universal language for Europe.
Right. Yeah, going back to the point of science-ism for a minute, one thing that I think that a lot of people are missing here is the idea that ultimately science can give us data, right? It can give us facts, but we are the ones who give that data meaning, right? So just recently, right, the election happened pretty recently, and now we're getting various, polling data, you know, regarding, say, Muslims and who they voted for. Well, you ultimately decide how to interpret that data. Right? If you see, according to that data, well, 30% of people said they voted for this guy, and 60% said they voted for this guy. Is that good or is that bad? Now, if you are a scienceist and you look at data, you're probably still taking someone's interpretation, right? How do you know what that means? Unless you're sitting there and doing all the interpreting yourself, then it's whoever these, as you put it, the priesthood, right? They are basically telling you how to interpret this data.
Yeah, so that's a problem of meaning in science. Facts in and of themselves can never give you meaning. They simply are. And I think we might have actually covered this in like the very first lecture we did, right? With the idea of if Tesla stock dropped by 50%, what does that mean? Right. Well, the data is you have one data point, or I guess two. You have the before and after, right?
Sure.
But what that means is entirely dependent on how you choose to interpret it. But there was a really good book. I think I actually brought this up in a previous lecture as well. Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I think I covered that. Um,
Perhaps you.
e- Either way, just in case I didn't, the idea is that science neither has the truth nor can give us the truth. And I'll put a link in the article. I'll put a link to the article in the description of sort of my very quick summary of the arguments of that book. And Thomas Kuhn is a PhD from, I want to say, Harvard in physics, and held the chairs of like history of physics and history of science and history of science and philosophy at places like Harvard and MIT and Stanford and right all of these top-notch institutions. So it's not like some random quack talking about it. And the idea is that science keeps, like, in order for science to quote, progress and give us new things, what inevitably happens to every single scientific theory is it gets completely debunked and then we completely throw it away. Now, every time we have a theory, we assume that it's true. And we kind of need to assume that it's true in order to invest time, money, and everything else into it. And then down the line, we figure out that it's not true, then we throw it all out, and then we assume the new thing is true. But like, how many of these steps are you going to go through believing that you're somehow closer to the truth? Right? Every step you assumed was true, and it turned out just as ineffectual long term as everything else. And none of this is a dig at science as science. I think we just sort of misunderstand what science is and what it does. I think science is all about functionality. Can I make the world do what I want it to do? And if my explanation for why the world is doing what it does is wrong, because it's not the truth, it doesn't really matter. In science, it doesn't really matter. It matters, am I getting the results that I want? So if I completely misunderstand how radiation works on cancer cells, that is irrelevant. So long as I can treat your cancer with radiation therapy. And by treat, I mean I can reduce the size of the cancerous tissue or kill it off or whatever it is, right? That's the only part that actually matters. So science isn't about truth, it's about functionality. And that's where this idea of scientism, I think, it gets super incoherent. because we're assuming that science is true. And you're like, well, what do you base that on? Because any science that you might have learned in school is younger than 100 years.
Hmm.
The idea that we have atoms and that those atoms are divided into protons, neutrons, and electrons, yeah, that's under 100 years old. Think about that for a second. I mean, we treat it as if it's some sort of gospel, like it's been around forever, and like no, it's like the last century. That's it, and we threw out everything else. And within that last century, we probably killed off 90% of theories that we came up with during that time as well. I mean, we're about to throw Einstein out. We're just trying to find a replacement. So let that sort of be a guide to just how truthful these things are.
Hmm. Yeah, and as you're saying this, I'm thinking, imagine that Islam functioned like how you're describing science here, right? We get a whole new revelation every few years or every generation that completely replaces the old one. Right? I think that that can help people to see the idea more clearly. Like, does that sound coherent to you? Does that sound consistent? That essentially Allah reveals a revelation to us, and then a few decades later, it's like, nope, throw that whole thing out. Here's what I actually want from you.
And that's actually how the Greeks had it, because again, Real Housewives of Olympus. But the the problem was, Zeus tells you, "I want this." I mean, the whole story of the fall of Troy, right? Athena tells you one thing, and then a year later, she's like, "No, whoops, made a mistake. Rewind all of that. None of that's true anymore." And I mean, Greeks fell apart specifically because of that. A society can't hold if it's based on ideas that keep rapidly shifting from one thing to another and sort of destroying themselves. You can have that as part of your society so long as the actual society is based on something that's stable and coherent and long lasting. So some feature of your society can do the back and forth because it's otherwise anchored in something solid.
Right. And in fact, that's exactly the point that Nasr is making regarding the Islamic sciences, is that they are anchored in Islam. So, one more point here in this first sentence, which is he also says that it gives them, referring to young Muslims, a sense of pride in their own civilization. When I read that, I'm reminded of how it seems like a lot of Muslims, perhaps even most of the Muslim world, especially the Arab world, seems to have a certain inferiority complex, right?
Yes.
Which I imagine probably largely comes about as a result of, losing in the First World War, the decline before that, and then colonialism. And I think we can trace a lot of these problems back to colonialism and Western ideas, and by extension, these Western ideas behind science and materialism finding their way into the Muslim world. So you've got people basically feeling like, well, we're not like them. They're the ones who won, so we now need to be more like them.
Yeah, that's a standard adaptation strategy, right? Like imagine in war, First World War. In fact, we had a bunch of this, right? A cavalry rides out, and the other side has machine guns,
Yeah.
right? And very quickly you go like, okay, um, we need to get machine guns because this ain't working. And so the problem, like I'm loath to put it all on colonialism because you wouldn't have gotten colonialism if the Muslim world had it together, right? Like the Ottoman Empire would not have fallen apart if it didn't already have a whole bunch of other problems, and then World War One, right? I mean, World War One is just the shove that they needed to collapse, but they were sort of headed in that direction all on their own.
Oh, yeah. Lost a major war against Russia just a few decades prior. I think they had their entire navy in the Black Sea destroyed by Russia.
Yeah, and so you got to ask yourself, how was that possible? Well, because a bunch of other things that used to function had stopped functioning for any number of reasons. Doesn't really matter, but it means that they were not able to contextually adapt to the times that they were in. So whether it's corruption that sets in, or I mean, it's always some version of corruption, right? If you have a military who refuses to upgrade and modernize by those standards, because this is the way that they always do things, and they can get away with it. That is no longer a military that is a service to the state. So you have some kind of a corruption uh, element. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody showing up and bribing you, but there is uh, corruption. So when you see that, you go like, okay, that's a pretty serious decline. If then whatever the Brits and the French and whoever shows up and just sort of buries you, and as a result, you have people who were unsatisfied already or dissatisfied already, and then they see like, well, what do these other people have that we don't? How is it that they're beating us? And that's a perfectly legitimate way of thinking, so long as you can separate out what is meaningful about their success and your loss, as opposed to the irrelevant factors. So if you go like, well, the British all wear knee-high socks, I'm pretty sure that's not why they won, right? But it is a data point. So if if your approach is something like they have a better material science, like okay, cool. Why do they have a better material science? Well, they have a better material science because they're a lot more heavily invested in it at the time, right? They've been publicly and privately funding research on this because they find it to be very valuable. The Islamic world had declined in that respect. So that's why the Brits are here, and we're down here. And instead of going like, hey, we need to invest in material science, we go like, no, we need to do science the way they do it, including all the irrelevant incidentals. One of the irrelevant incidentals happens to be the materialistic view of the world as you do science. Because obviously, so it's incidental because the millennia of progress in the Islamic world on material sciences, I think, demonstrates pretty damn well that you can put Islam and the Islamic axiomatic understanding of the world together with material science, create a level of progress unmatched anywhere in the world. But if on top of wanting to improve your stuff, you also have the inferiority complex that you mentioned, which says something like the things I have are less valuable than the things that the colonial power has. But one of the things you have is a way of viewing the world through the lens of Islam. And now that makes you backwards and it makes you incompatible. In fact, I'm listening to this lecture series on the rise and fall of the British Empire and the rise of the Western educated middle class and upper middle class in the colonies is specifically people who think that way, right? Now they might want to, like Gandhi, right, empower their own people. But the idea is that the only sort of proper way to empower people is going to be through these Western ways of viewing the world because the local ways are backwards. So the idea is you have to get rid of your own culture, history, and everything else in order to advance. You have to become whatever British like or French like or whatever it is. And I don't think that that's a necessary thing. I think we sort of go back to the idea of El Ghazali and his understanding of picking out the valuable from the garbage, and you talked about that last week as well. But when you have a bunch of people who are sort of ill-educated to begin with, and then they have an inferiority complex, well, then they're going to do a very bad job of determining what needs to go and what needs to stay. For example, the thing that really needs to go is something like the nepotism throughout the Muslim world. Like who's the head of the university? The cousin to the president. Like, yeah. Like, I'm not saying that can't happen, but that person still needs to be the best qualified person, and not do that part. All right, let's move on to the next sentence here. It is furthermore a testament to the way Islam was able to cultivate various sciences extensively without becoming alienated from the Islamic worldview and without creating a science whose application would destroy the world of nature and the harmony that must exist between man and the natural environment. Your thoughts?
All right. Yeah, let's start with this first idea here. The idea that Islam was able to cultivate these sciences extensively without becoming alienated from the Islamic worldview. So, as we were just talking about before, that seems to be the problem with a lot of people today, or a lot of people in the Muslim world today, that uh, they've decided to throw out the Islamic worldview, right, and adopt the Western worldview. And as you've discussed before, right, a worldview has to have a set of principles, right, a set of axioms that it starts from. So this means that people have basically thrown those ideas out, the Islamic axioms, and adopted a new set. But there's that assumption that, oh, if there's a conflict between Islam and science, or more generally between religion and science, that you must have to do that. And so I think one of the goals of Nasr in this chapter, and one of the things we can really get out of it as well, is that no, you don't have to do that.
Yeah, I think you would have to do that only if the way that you conceive of the world through your axiomatic setup cannot be borne out in reality. And I don't mean like, oh, that there's like a point where there's some kind of disagreement or something. Like, it would have to be sort of to go back to the Kuhnian way of understanding this. You need to have a kind of crisis, which means a central issue that, despite years of research and effort, is not resolvable. And the Greeks, for example, had that problem because the way that they had conceived of Olympian divinity just didn't match reality, right? If you read Homer, there's supposed to be gods just popping out of every orifice. And that sort of held for a while the Greeks were very separated into little villages, days apart. And it was never anybody from like the next village over. It was always like two villages away who ran into some god or whatever, that the story could maintain. But once they actually started traveling about, it became pretty clear that like that's just not the way anything works long term. And then they had a bunch of internal inconsistencies, and then the whole thing falls apart. If you have a functional worldview, and I think you find that in like the big six religions these days. So you have in the East, you have Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and then the three Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. All six of those have a solid enough basis of understanding the world that allows for new information to come in, and they don't sort of quake if some latest scientific idea doesn't match what they have. It's always about like, well, how can it be interpreted? How can it be understood? What does our text say? What does, right? All the rest of that. So the Islamic worldview was able to explore a vast array of ideas, and to do that without running into a meaningful contradiction with itself, right? And therefore, as he phrases it, it was able to cultivate various sciences extensively without becoming alienated from the Islamic worldview. I don't think that new sciences have really offered anything sort of new in that respect. I do think that most Muslims are unaware of how Islam and sciences come together because they're mostly unaware of Islam. And so it looks like there's some sort of a problem or a contradiction or something along those lines. And like really, there isn't. If you actually bother studying, there's a pretty clear answer that's available.
Yeah. How about the second part here? It also says, without creating a science whose application would destroy the world of nature and the harmony that must exist between man and the natural environment. So, uh, this seems to be a dig at Western sciences here, that uh, essentially what the Europeans started doing was acting as though nature existed to serve man, and that inevitably is going to lead to destroying nature, right? We cut down the forests, and then we're surprised to discover all these problems that show up later on. California is dealing with massive wildfires, for example. The big issue today is climate change, and despite people talking about it and knowing about it for decades, very little has actually been done. And it really seems like the reason for that is that people really haven't uh, taken the time to think, I suppose you could say, or perhaps they haven't changed their value set such that they look at nature as something that we must preserve and must protect for our own good, as well as just as an end in and of itself. Right? He goes even farther and says that there is a harmony that must exist between man and the natural environment. If you're building factories that spew pollution into the air and cutting down entire forests, uh, you don't really seem to hold with that idea of there being a harmony between man and the natural environment. Instead, it is the natural environment must serve man. From an Islamic standpoint, we have the idea of, that mankind is a khalifa on the earth, a vicegerent. And so if you internalize that idea and you really consider what it means, then we essentially need to be functioning as caretakers as opposed to exploiters.
Now, I think to build on that, the idea of being a caretaker doesn't mean that you have to, sake of argument, doesn't mean that you're not allowed to build factories. But it does mean that you don't have an intrinsic right to destroy the environment, because the environment does in fact have some sort of an intrinsic value in and of itself. There's a really good article. It's older a bit. It's by a guy named Lynn White, and it's called something like the religious roots of our ecological crisis. I'll put a link in the description. I took that article as a basis uh, for an article I wrote on Islamic environmental ethics, and sort of so because Lynn White goes at it from a Christian perspective, and there is this. It's not a necessary way of reading it, but it is historically the primary way of reading the creation of man's story in the Christian and Jewish scripture. That says something like the purpose of reality is to cater to us. And if that's the case, then the only value that anything has is its value to us. Therefore, it has no intrinsic value. It only has value as utility to me. And therefore, if I would get more utility from that forest by cutting it down, if I would get more utility out of polluting than not polluting, then that's exactly what I should do, right? The Islamic starting point though is different. So one of the things that's there that I think actually in that article that I think echoes pretty well here is the idea that you can't extrapolate from one thing to all the things, right? So the same way that Lynn White does uh, the the analysis of the Christian understanding of things and how that led to the crisis, as you read that, you very quickly understand, if you know anything about religions, that you can't extrapolate from European version of Christianity onto religion in general. And so the same way you can't extrapolate, for example, in this chapter, the sort of problems that religion and science together face in the West, you can't extrapolate that out to the problem of religion as such and science as such. It's a particular historical moment. So the idea that, as you noted, the role of Khilafah is to have human beings act in such a way as to fit in with the rest of creation because the rest of that creation has its own intrinsic value. That means that we have to be harmonious Islamically, right? And so it is un-Islamic to create science whose application is intended to be the destruction of the world of nature, right? By the way, that doesn't mean that you can't design a chainsaw, but it does mean that the kinds of highly toxic and highly polluting systems need to be, well, not toxic and not polluting by whatever means we have available.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, Going off of something you said earlier, one of the problems with adopting a materialistic view of nature and its purpose is that even within the discussions that we see today on the subject, they're still premised on that basis, right? So to go back to the example of cutting down a forest, you say, well, uh, we cut down the forest because it's in our short-term interest, right? We get some benefit out of it now. And someone would respond to that by saying, hey, wait a second, what about our long-term interest, right? That's, the argument, global warming, climate change, right? It said, but you're forgetting the fact that this is going to end up harming us in the long run. And the key there is the us, right? Those arguments are still premised on the idea that nature is for our own benefit, not the idea that there's an intrinsic value in it.
Right. There's a really powerful argument from Slavoj Žižek of all people on the idea on the absurdity of the idea of capitalist corporate development of stuff like green or sustainable practices or so if the idea in capitalism is to keep accruing wealth, then for example, was it Starbucks sells ethos water, right? I'm sure people have seen that, and they're like, oh, it's whatever, it's not organic, whatever the phrase is for the organic version of water source, and all the rest of that. And so, because of that, you're supposed to give us your money to get water, right? Like it's still a sales pitch, right? It's still in a toxic plastic bottle and so on and so forth. But the that's sort of the idea of solving a problem created by capitalism or materialism by using more capitalism or materialism. It's like, no, 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 that's what got you in trouble to begin with, right? You're not going to dig yourself out of a hole by just shoveling faster. The next sentence I think is really a fun one. Is the Islamic sciences are not only important from the point of view of science understood in its current Western sense, but they also have a spiritual and intellectual significance. And to follow that up, their study and understanding is important in order to create a bridge in the mind of young Muslims between Western science, which many of them are studying, and tenets of Islam to which they must remain faithful. So this actually ties into something that Nasr says early on in this chapter, this idea that Islamic sciences are different than the Western approach to science. And that doesn't mean that we have some other magical sciences that we're studying, right? It's still the same kinds of science. But the Islamic sciences have an axiomatic Islamic interpretation of the world. right? So your starting point on how you will interpret things has to be in line with the Islamic ideas of the world. Meanwhile, the modern Western idea of science is ultimately premised on a that 16th or 17th century idea of Descartes that turns the world into pure materialistic playground. Right? It's a position that says that if a thing is real, it has to be quantifiable. We have to be able to weigh and measure it. And the Islamic position does not, in fact, take that as an intrinsic starting point. So I think the idea then is something like this. If you understand sciences from an Islamic perspective, not only do you get the materialistic reading of, let's talk about like physics or biology or something, right? Not only do you, not only are you able to do biology and physics and all that, but the way that you interpret what it all means is going to be the kind of thing that you can't get if you're just interpreting it from a materialistic only standpoint. And to maybe build off that a little bit, if as a Muslim you're both unaware of this massive intellectual history and you buy into that starting Western premise of pure materialism, there is no way that that's going to work. Because the starting point of Western materialism says something like God can't exist. Right? That's why this idea of conflict between science and religion. Can you quantify God? Can you weigh and measure him? Because if you can't, then he can't be real. That's the sort of conclusion that is ultimately come to. And but that only applies if you're starting off with your first assumption being the only things that are real are things that are quantifiable, that can be weighed and measured. So I think that's where a lot of young Muslims sort of get stuck, right? They're learning the science, and that the science obviously provides results, but they're unaware of the fact that there is a different way to interpret the same data.
So if someone were to, at this point, ask a question like, all right, you've talked about how there's a Western way of looking at science, right? A Western worldview, and there's an Islamic worldview. Well, you've mentioned a few things that make it different, right? You've mentioned the idea that there must be an intrinsic value to nature. You've mentioned the idea that that we have a responsibility, right, as the Khilafah. We have the responsibility as caretakers. Well, what really are, or what else is there really? What really are the key axioms that would separate an Islamic scientist from a Western scientist? What is it about the Islamic way of looking at it that gives it this extra spiritual significance?
So there's again, I'm gonna have to put a link in the description here, but there's an entire video I did on this for my ethics class. It sort of walks you through the axioms theory, practice, and the worldview of of a religious ideology. And in that case, like I didn't make it specifically Islamic, and in fact, it applies to the big six, so to speak. But one of the one, it's sort of like a the core axiom that's going to make the separation possible, and that really defines it, is the idea of telos, of purpose. If you believe that the world has a purpose, then everything in that world has a purpose. And since you didn't set the purpose, somebody else did. So you are sort of a guest in somebody else's house. And so the way that you should behave isn't up to you, and the way that you should understand things isn't up to you. It's up to the source of the purpose. So in dealing with examining reality, the difference between classifying things with my interests in mind, as opposed to trying to find out the essential qualities of a thing that make it what it is, understanding that it has value whether it has any value to me or not, is going to be one of these massive differences. But that's based on this starting axiom that all things have a purpose. Now, one of the problems with the idea of purpose is that, well, can you weigh and measure some purpose? Yeah. So that means that purpose isn't the real thing, according to the materialistic worldview. It's just a figment of our imagination. So, to give you an idea, by the way, a very practical one, I think, uh, the entire theory of evolution was posited about 1,000 years prior to Darwin. And it was posited by, in fact, Nasr points him out here, he's an Abyssinian origin Muslim in Baghdad by the name of El Jahiz. The guy was brilliant. And in his book, in fact, it's a book that Nasr points out, the Kitab al-Haywan, the Book of Animals, he lays out the entire thing, starting with external pressures, like interspecies pressures and resources, and then intraspecies pressures, and what that means for which animals within the species manage to reproduce, and what that means for the next generation, and then traits, and all the rest of that. The dude literally did all the work, and he died in 850. Darwin publishes like 1851. So 1,001 years after El Jahiz, there is the Darwin publication. The thing that Darwin did that El Jahiz didn't is Darwin actually moved. Right? El Jahiz sat there and figured this out theoretically. Darwin got on a boat and then went and sort of tried to confirm this as best he could. Now, when El Jahiz wrote out his theory of evolution, the Islamic world did not bat an eye, and that was the accepted way of thinking. In fact, it was so well accepted that a decade after Darwin publishes, John Draper, first head of the American Chemistry Association, when talking about Darwinism, doesn't talk about it as Darwinian evolution. He calls it the Mohammedan theory of evolution. Now, it's Mohammedan because he's writing in like 1860s, but you get the idea, right? So they knew this as a theory out of the Islamic world, and Muslims didn't have a problem with it. Now, the problem that showed up with Darwin specifically is, remember, he's looking at this through a completely materialistic lens. And so he looks at how the animals survive or don't survive, or how they attempt to adapt, and the little genetic glitches and all the rest of it. And he comes to the conclusion that there is no such thing as order or purpose or design, because it's all pure chaos and chance. And that destroys the idea of telos. So there was no purpose to the universe after Darwin. El Jahiz looked at the same thing, but he has a different starting axiom. He thinks that everything has a purpose. So El Jahiz says, like, yeah, of course, what actually survives long term and what doesn't, and how things will develop, is up to God. But the will of God isn't a thing that you can quantify. You're not going to find it as a material component of the theory that you're looking at, right? So the same way that I can't see your intention, and you're a human being, and I'm looking at you through a Zoom screen, I can't see the will of God either. But as a starting axiom, the idea is that, of course, God controls like what the final outcome is, right? Because he knows what the final outcome is. But Darwin can't have that, because will is not something that you can weigh and measure. And so the difference is, when you interpret this, essentially the same ideas from an Islamic science point of view, you get a thing that fits perfectly fine into our idea of Islam and of everything else for that matter. But when you look at it from a secular point of view, from a materialistic point of view, all the sort of additional meaning otherwise applied by Islam is stripped out. And all you're left with is just the material component. And so then you come to some god awful conclusions. Like eugenics is, I mean, very clearly off of Darwinism as a theory. So it's a notice, by the way, that the Islamic world never developed eugenics, and we had an additional 1,000 years of having the theory. So that should be an indication of what Nasr means by the sort of spiritual and intellectual significance of the Islamic interpretation as opposed to just a pure materialist interpretation.
All right, let's move on. Their study and understanding is important in order to create a bridge in the mind of young Muslims between Western science, which many of them are studying, and the tenets of Islam to which they must remain faithful. That sounds pretty self-explanatory to me there, right? The idea that we need to understand the Islamic sciences so that this possible cognitive dissonance in the minds of young Muslims, right? They learn Western science and they got people there telling them that this is incompatible with Islam, or maybe they've even internalized some parts of the Western worldview, or perhaps the entirety of it, into their own thinking, right? That's precisely what makes this so important, is to overcome that. I think the big hang up for a lot of Muslims on this subject isn't what you're referring to as adaptation there, right? Microevolution. The problem tends to show up a lot more with macro evolution. The idea that one species can essentially become another, or at least that some members of a species over a long enough time have changed to such an extent that they are now a different species. Because, Darwin basically looks at that and concludes, well, there you go. Human beings were therefore descended from some species of ape, right? Over some lengthy time period, one species into another, and eventually you get to Homo sapiens. And that's the area that leads a lot of Muslims today to say, nope, got to throw out the whole evolution thing. Because we believe that Allah created Adam in, fully formed, just like that, created Adam. That's an essential part of our Aqidah. And so any theory that argues differently from that needs to be thrown out.
Right. And so I think there we can get into the sort of literal and metaphoric interpretations, not in the sense of like, oh, but didn't create him really fully formed, but sort of like, what does that mean?
Right, yeah, I'm not anywhere
given.
Near, I was gonna say, I'm not anywhere near knowledgeable enough on that subject to say like, oh, I've got the perfect answer right there.
Oh yeah, no, that me either.
I am sure that there are people out there, who are well versed enough in both subjects, right? Because you have to be well versed in, the scientific aspects of that subject, but then you also essentially have to be an expert in tafsir, right? In understanding, the language used in the Quran. You really need to be an expert in both of those areas if you're going to, have an informed opinion on the matter. Because if you want my opinion, I'm just spitballing here, really, on that subject.
Exactly, right? But one of the sort of issues that comes up for me is, for example, El Jahiz talks exactly about macroevolution. He starts off with micro, and his conclusion is that like over a long enough time period, this surviving set of members from some species who were in a competition for whatever resources can change so much that they are not at all identifiable as members of that original set, right? That they have changed so much that they're a whole new thing. And in fact, the Muslims for the next couple of 100 years, Muslim scholars tended to actually think that it might be possible to move between, to evolve both up and down, right, between different levels of things. So the idea of whether it's possible for a, as he points out, right, like Muslims came up with the, oh my God, mineral, vegetable, animal sort of
Right.
distinction. So the question was, is it possible to actually move between those things? Can you have an animal, for example, that sort of evolves down into some form of a mineral, or a mineral that moves up to some sort of a plant? Now, that might sound a little funny, but like certainly a whole bunch of minerals have a whole lot of properties of growth in a way that makes you go like, is that thing kind of living? Right? Like if you watch crystals grow, that's one of those things where you're like, that's a little off from the way that you're expecting minerals to behave. So there was this whole study of that, and nobody sort of seemed to blink on that issue either. So that leads me to believe something like uh, there are at least some ways in which very well educated Muslims at that time understood this as being a possibility without throwing the wrench into it like the one that we seem to think is there. And I think part of the problem that we have as Muslims in this environment is that quite often we take on Christian problems as Islamic problems, right? We assume that a problem in Christianity automatically translates into a problem in Islam, and that's not the case. So obviously not as a solution, but as maybe an initial sort of thought point. Adam and Eve are created in a place where there is no, well, entropy, for lack of a better term. There is no aging. There is no death. Does that sound like any place in the universe? Because last I checked, every place in the universe is permanently subject to entropy. Well, if they're not created within the universe, which by the way makes sense, right? That the universe ends as part of eschatology, haha, chapter two. Um, the universe ends, but heaven and hell already exist, and they're not ended by the fact that the universe ends. So that when you have a revival over there, you can have a bodily revival, that isn't the issue, but what does it mean to have a body that is not in the universe? Might indicate certain sorts of problems in the way that we generally tend to think of this. Uh, as a physical body was taken from Jannah and transplanted physically into uh, uh, onto Earth as the way that it was over there. Um, because there is no, there doesn't have to be a logically necessary reason for that to be the case. Now, that may very well be the case because, again, I'm spitballing, but that's sort of the first thing that came to mind, right? As I used to think about that, I'm like, well, they're not in the universe. So, what does it mean for them to be lowered down? What part of them? And do you have to bodily transplant them? Can you take their consciousness, which is the essence of what they are, and plop it into a thing that has been sort of progressing anyway, because that's how you've set up the universe? Like that might be, again, please don't take this as any sort of uh, fiqh ruling on how we should be understanding evolution. Uh, but just sort of as a starting point, like that would be the first thing that comes to my mind for what the options could be. And if it took me like 2 seconds to come up with that, I'm sure that if you actually go and you find actual scholars of this, they're going to have something far more uh, coherent to say on the topic that than I do.
Like I said at the beginning, one of the nice things about this chapter is that Nasr is giving you a lot of places to go. He's giving you a lot of people who, great thinkers and scholars who accomplish tremendous things in these fields, and he's giving you a brief overview. Uh, and if you're really interested in learning more about it, like the subject that we're discussing here, go to the sources because they're there. On top of the fact that there are certainly people today who are looking into and writing about these subjects too. And I think, in a way, this leads into the last sentence of the paragraph as well. The idea that the great achievement of the Muslim men of science was that they had the most rigorous standards of critical thought and were scientists of integrity without at the same time losing their faith or becoming alienated from the Islamic view of the universe within which all of the Islamic sciences were cultivated. So, what is the great achievement here? It's two things. First off, rigorous standards of critical thought and integrity, and the ability to maintain those things while at the same time not losing their faith or becoming alienated from the Islamic view of the universe. Now, critical thought, of course, is something we've talked about quite a lot. The idea that they were scientists of integrity, what that strikes me as meaning is they didn't take a discovery and say, wait a second, I cannot reconcile this with how I understand Islam. Therefore, I am going to ignore it. I am going to throw it out and treat it like it never happened. Because, of course, that would be the opposite of integrity. And unfortunately, we do run into quite a bit of that today. Not even strictly from the Islamic standpoint. I mean, you will find that all the time just in the sciences, unfortunately. How is it that so many studies in various fields, especially in the social sciences, are not replicable? Right? A lot of times it's because someone started with the conclusion and then went looking for the evidence to support that conclusion.
It's not just the social sciences. Man, if I'm remembering this correctly, out of like 53 accepted cancer treatments, 47 were not replicable. And you're like, holy crap. Like, people's lives, like, hinge on this. And that means that, like, 47 of these things were as effective as doing nothing.
Sure. And now someone may say, hey, wait a second. That's the physical sciences there. It shouldn't be possible to lie in that area. How could they get a study result that says that it worked? Well, that's the funny thing about doing a whole bunch of trials, right? I'm not saying this is what happened, but the first thing that comes to my mind is if you ran 100 different trials, in a few of them, you're going to get results that just through randomness end up showing that your drug ended up having a positive effect.
So I'll link three things on this topic down below. Two are TED Talks by Ben Goldacre. That the guy is he studies, right? That's his shtick, and he's a very funny guy, and he does these relatively quick presentations. They're both, I think, one's 13 minutes, one's 18, and they're great to sort of give you a sense of just how screwy things are in sciences. And the other thing I'll link down there is a video on p hacking in sciences, and it's how to take garbage data and turn it into well-respected, published um, articles. Uh, and it, of course, results in things like the inability to replicate things. I think uh, the claims made in psychology journals, like more than 50% of them, are not replicable in any way now. That's not that's not a negligible amount of things that have gone terribly wrong. So again, it's
Yeah.
but by the way, notice it's right back to interpretation, right? The data can be the same, but how you interpreted it is essentially everything. Um,
Right. Yeah. Specifically regarding the subject of p hacking, p is the probability that the results that you got were random chance. You know, what are the chances that these two, data sets, right? One of them, the control, and one of them with whatever the change is that we're talking about. What are the chances that that could still happen as a result of random chance, even if it looks like there's some sort of a correlation here? And you want that number to be as small as possible. And I mean, the ideal figure would be, like under a 1% chance. But a lot of scientists are willing to accept, especially social scientists, are willing to accept even like a 5% chance. And it gets especially dangerous when they start saying, oh, well, we'll accept a 10% chance here. And then you get problems where they'll do things like saying, which control variables are we even going to include in there? And because that ends up affecting it. When I was in graduate school for political science, I did some quantitative analysis there, and you can see that happen, right? If I'm looking at a particular subject, I'm trying to figure out why such and such thing happens. And my theory is, well, I think that this particular thing that happens in a country increases the chance of, I don't know, let's say terrorism happening there. Well, what things am I going to control for? Am I going to control for the size of the country? Am I going to control for its region? Am I going to control for the age of the population? And so on and so forth. All these things you could control for. Well, you may find as you control for different ones that your p-value changes. And unfortunately, I even had a professor one time tell me, right, we were just having a discussion about a particular quantitative analysis that I was trying to run. And I said something to the effect of like, well, what happens if my hypothesis turns out to be false? What if we get nothing? The idea is that something called the null hypothesis, or the hypothesizing that no changes happen. What if that ends up being correct? And his answer was basically something to the effect of, well, I mean, you already created this whole theory behind why it should happen. So if you're going to put that in there, right, a theory behind why it should happen, and then you find nothing, then you basically have to argue that the results are counterintuitive. And that's not good, and we shouldn't do that. And it was at that moment that I became a little more disenchanted with the social sciences.
Oh, don't worry. Physics does the same thing. How to do physics? First, you do some math, 1 plus 1, and then you take a look at your result. And if the answer isn't what you predicted, then add a dark variable, x, and ta-da! Congratulations! Now you're doing math like a physicist.
All right. Anyway, the point here is the Islamic scientists were, as we say here, scientists of integrity who had rigorous standards of critical thought. And they were able at the same time to do this without losing their faith or becoming alienated from the Islamic view of the universe. And what that really should tell you right there is, well, if they can do it, then I can do it too. Right? It's not like there's something stopping me from being able to do that, right? You should instead look at your own premises, look at your own axioms, and say to yourself, why am I having problems reconciling this? Maybe I should go to the people who were able to reconcile it, look at how they did that, and I can gain some insight into what I should be thinking.
Yeah, finding role models in how you deal with the kind of information that comes your way in a meaningful way without uh, undermining the sort of integrity part of that equation. And I don't know, my position has always been that I'm not the smartest guy in the room, right? Or if I am, we're all in trouble. And so if I get stuck on something, it doesn't mean that uh, in this case, Islam is wrong or that logic is wrong or whatever. It just means that it's more than likely that I got something wrong. So I need to go find somebody a lot smarter than me and have them uh, explain this to me so that I am no longer ignorant of the topic. But I've certainly seen plenty of people whose starting assumption is the flip side. Like if it doesn't make sense to me, that means that it doesn't make sense, and then we're sort of done with the whole conversation. That's I mean, besides rather obviously being questionable, it's that the amount of hubris that's kind of needed for that maneuver is just it's exceptionally high. To go like, well, I am the standard by which things make sense. Ah, plenty of plenty of things that I look at and that they just look like Greek to me, including Greek. So it's I think a little bit of humility goes a long way. But I think knowing that there have been these generations of experts helps with that humility, right? When you read any of these people, they're all just genius level thinkers. Like I don't think that there's a single one of them who doesn't have the equivalent of like 3 or 4 PhDs, uh, and all that like by the time they're 30 or something. I mean, Ibn Sina wrote his the Qanun of Medicine. I want to say in his 20s.
Mm.
He wrote an encyclopedia of medicine in his 20s, and that was the primary medical text for like 3 continents for the next 700 years. And that was like the start of his career. And then, after medicine, then he got into, philosophy and math and all the rest of this. And you're like, wow, I am an idiot by comparison. So, the fact that it doesn't make sense to me is no indication of anything other than my own ignorance. I think that's a relatively healthy way to look at anything.
I definitely agree.
All
I
right,
think we need
let's.
to wrap this up here.
Yes. All right. So thank you all for listening. If you have questions or comments, you can either leave it in the comments if those are open, or you can email us. Also, don't forget to check the description for links to all the varieties of things that we talked about. And yeah, that's it. Take care. See you next time.